I glanced at my watch and it was 22:30.
What, 2:30?
22:30.
Ooh.
I suggested to Renee that it was getting late and she understood readily, saying she would be back in the moment. I paid the waiter, thanked him for a pleasant dinner, and left him a few francs. Renee returned, and I helped her with her sweater, caressing her shoulder as I did. I slipped on my field jacket. As we stepped outside, the night air was nippy and refreshing. She wanted to walk back, but I suggested that it was too far to walk at night, and we would get a taxi. I would then drop her off, and I would take her to the metro stop. At night in Paris, during the 1940s, was it safe to walk around the streets around midnight?
No, there were no blackout.
No, besides that,
Yeah.
was there any problem people roaming the streets in Paris?
Not 10 o'clock at night, no.
No, there's none. Okay, all right.
They told around every day.
Okay. I replied that I enjoyed every minute and I was sorry that it had to end so shortly. She sat close to me as we drove in the taxi. What kind of taxi was it?
Old-fashioned.
Was it like,
The big high canopy.
so I'm trying to picture, it was an old taxi. It wasn't long, but it was high.
Yeah.
And the driver in the front had one
The
seat.
driver could sit two, and there's a middle chair, they could sit three, and the back chair could sit three. You could take 8 people.
So some of the chairs would pull up,
Yeah,
but either way, it was very cramped.
yeah.
And I imagine that was a manual shift.
Oh, yeah.
I imagine that was also a diesel. Yeah,
He was shifting all the time.
yeah. She forgot herself and started speaking in French, and then we quickly apologized and stammered in English. Come every day, I shall miss you if you don't. We reached her house and I walked to the door. We embraced and kissed and I whispered, tomorrow. She opened the door and entered and I got back into the taxi and told the driver Etampes station. The next morning after chow, we had a general news meeting which covered the latest news of the war, along with some newsworthy items from the States, following a 20-minute Army film on VD and how to prevent it. I sat through it thinking of how Renee looked last night and wondering what she had planned for today. As I sat through the Army film, I promised myself that I would get more inquisitive with Renee and pursue more of the questions that were troubling me. I would have to pick the right moment and I did not want to offend her in any way. I was hoping that we would spend more time at her home, which I thought would be conducive to a personal discussion. I picked the pass a little bit after 1200 hours and was on my way to the metro station, thinking of how fortunate I was in meeting Renee again. I thought it was ultimately coming to an end in a few short days and becoming only a memory. I would not think of that now, lest I become despondent and melancholy. I wanted to see Renee, and it was a pleasure I should savor and enjoy. I had been through all of this several times before with Ann and Jean, and it was getting more easier the third time around. Some of the other patients in my room also made frequent trips to Paris, and they asked me to join them several times. They were more of a debased and unpretentious group. I did not concur, nor was in sympathy with their antics. They would talk of how inebriated they would become and take great delight in telling of the many brawls and fights they had participated in. So the other guys in the hospital would basically go to Paris on a regular basis just to get drunk.
Yeah.
And who would they be fighting with? You said
The
brawls.
civilians.
The natives?
Civilians, yeah.
They wouldn't be fighting among themselves, were they?
No.
They would just, I can't understand why, they're guests in their town, but
Uh-huh.
did that happen quite a bit? These guys were always fighting?
Yeah, once they start drinking.
Once they start drinking,
Yeah.
they were always fighting, yeah. Yeah, that makes sense, yeah.
That wasn't all of them, there were some of them.
Some of them. Some of them. Okay. I would surely not give up my visit to see Renee for the privilege of going out drinking with my combat buddies. As I sat on the train, I thought of all that transpired for me the past year. As I thought about it, I wondered if I could go back home and leave all this behind me. Surely I had been affected by all of it, and I had grown in the stature of my experience. I had developed a self-confidence in my innate ability and awareness of myself. I was also no longer passive, subjective creature I depicted when I first entered the service. Could I go back to what I was, all this desolate and negative aspirations? These were the first inklings of my apprehension about returning home. I had not thought about my returning. My mind was preoccupied with entering combat and wondering if I would survive it. Anne and Jean would put on a new viable dimension in my life, and I would be forever grateful and indebted to them. With Renee, it seemed that I had reached a maturity. My state of equilibrium was on par with my desires and my anticipations, and I also achieved a sense of confidence of reasonably attaining the goals I had set for myself. There was none of the frustrations and balancings of emotions I had experienced with Anne, and to a lesser extent with Jean. I did not need any quick answers now. The dilemma with Anne and Jean was nowhere to be found. Would I make a life with Renee and look back in a second if she would have me? What had happened in the interim that made me so positive? When I was with her, where I was once unsettled. Was it maturity, or was it something deeper and more elusive? As I thought of the new and strange sense of discovery and the relief it afforded me, there was a lingering inner recess of my subconsciousness, very familiar and frightening theme that would never be part of her life. Somehow I would be deprived of it. I had been on so many different occasions. As always, just it would be within my grasp, it would, and then the last moment elude me and be forever lost. Even so, there was a small kernel of certainty throughout it all. I was not tearing myself apart and trying to understand right thing to do. Up to now, I was disarrayed and discord most of the time, anticipating my desires, and at the same time, in instance, seeking a higher altruistic meaning to it all. With Renee, it was entirely less complex, as there are no driving inner desire to make decisions that would affect their lives forever. I felt no compulsion, and certainly Renee led me to believe otherwise. Our friendship emanated from a mutual understanding of another and developed as we nurtured and cultivated it. Much of the same had taken place with Anne and Jean, but one notable exception. In Renee's case, there was none of the inevitable obligation to make a far-reaching decision. I would say, not knowing of what I speak, that Renee's experienced many more personal hardships during this war than either Anne or Jean. It was only inevitable she was closer to the war. One could see it in her mannerisms and her personal maturity she displayed. Anne and Jean were also mature, but there's maturity through evolution, whereas Renee's was maturity through necessity and traumatic experiences. The conductor hailed Paris as our next stop, and I was snapped back to reality. It was a cool, damp day outside with a heavy overcast of clouds and crisp wind blowing from the east. We were issued a new type of field jacket, and since the nights were getting down to 35 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, notwithstanding the wind, I felt the Army overcoat would be a useful item. I hailed a taxi and gave the driver the address, 5 Rue St. Andres. He nodded and gave me a civilian salute by touching the tip of his visor on his cap. I reached the familiar large oaken door and grasped the brass knocker to announce my arrival. Renee was there on the second knock, looking quite chic. She smiled and said, "Bonjour," taking my hand and leading me to the parlor. She said that we would be only a few minutes and she would be finished the portrait of the little girl she had yesterday. I told her not to hurry and that I would wait here in the parlor until she finished. She smiled gently, looked at me for a second, and then left the room. I took off my field jacket as it was quite warm in the room with a large fire blazing in a stone fireplace. I started to walk about the room. It was a rather large room with paned glass doors in several locations. The ceilings were higher, taller than I reached with my outstretched arm, and then they contained several large square beams running the short width of the room. The room was furnished with a comfortable couch and several overstuffed chairs. On the floor was an oval rug which covered the center of the floor, exposing the rest of the oaken flooring, polished to a higher luster. One of the oval tables were displayed several photographs. One was 2 elderly people, a man and a woman. Right next to them were 2 young men in uniform. In one corner of the room stood a large cabinet of shelves and displayed the array of books and periodicals. I peered at the titles, but many were in French. As I flipped the pages, one of them appeared pictures and faces and figures in different stages of development. I assumed it was some kind of art book and slid it back among the other books. There were several windows in the room which traversed the entire height of the wall and draped with every pale green material. On the over table was a large lamp with an ivory-colored shade topping its height. Near to the table was a straight-backed chair, and it did not appear to get much wear, for it seemed in excellent condition. The only piece of furniture in the room was a small low bench in front of the fireplace. It looked comfortable, and I sat there with my back toward the fireplace. I gazed at the room in its entirety and was struck by one all-consuming thought. It was a room that would expect to see a convent or a monastery, a room for a person sequestered or in solitude. The silence and majesty of its entire ambience suggested a reverence and saintly respect. The portrait of religious figures on the 2 inner walls only magnified and intensified my instinct for the room. I had an awesome, inspiring aura about it, and it did not make me feel uncomfortable. It did allure to something out of the ordinary, adding to the enigma I was discerning in Renee. Renee entered the room, and it seemed that the very moment that she complimented the very serenity of the room, as the entire structure of the room bring there was a total concept. It was a strange feeling, and it bewildered me as well as captivating my inner self. She sat next to me on the bench, the closest of her body, in a frame which captured all my senses. I could think of only one thing, to take her in my arms and kiss her. She anticipated my desire and leaned forward. I smiled, taking her hand and putting it on my chest. Come and help me prepare lunch, she explained, smiling. In the kitchen, I watched as she expertly manipulated pots and pans, looking at me now and then. She moved gracefully and almost effortlessly as she went about the business in preparing lunch. I could not help reminding me of Anne. In the same circumstance, I also watched her in the kitchen in Owensboro. I asked what she was preparing, and she remarked brains, which a nonchalant breed of familiarity. I smiled and thought of the rare occasion we had.
What are you giving me?
We had
One more.
same dish at
Stupid
home.
candy.
I could not remember how I reached then, but I am sure I would form an entirely different opinion of them now. She said, so she was making you brains, and you said you were familiar with it. Did your mother make you brains on a regular occasion?
No.
But your mother made it for you before, right?
She made the brains when I got over in Europe. I
Okay.
told her about it.
Okay. And how'd you like the brains?
Well, my mother made it differently.
Which one did you like better?
My mother.
Okay. Why'd she spice them up some, or what was the difference?
Huh?
What was the difference? What?
Well, I was used to my mother's cooking.
Oh, okay. Are you hungry? She whispered into my ear, rubbing my chest and pressing her. I reached up and kissed her lips and were warm. Renee was prepared the brains by first cleaning them thoroughly, next boiling them rigorously for 5 to 10 minutes. Then she would drain them and several with butter and capers, assorted relishes. She called it Frances de Cervelle, which sounded, as she spoke, a lot more delectable than it actually looked, and more importantly, how it tasted. She also grilled some of the sweetbread skewered with licorice sticks. In my estimation, it was not that great. What it consisted was with the thymus or the pancreas gland of a calf or lamb. Frankly, I did not care for any of it, but ate its serving of it to please Renee. The French were great eaters before and after the war, but eventually more difficult to eat the various parts with their strong, pungent odor and much less to prepare them. Renee would relate how as a girl she would eat curried lamb's brains and blanched pig's intestines, or at special occasions she was treated to the stomach of a cow, boiled with its hoofs and garnished with carrots. She then recited the 4 happy families: the brain, the heart, the kidneys, and the liver. I was impressed but not convinced. The food was definitely not for me. So you didn't care for it. You didn't care for the food.
The what?
You didn't like the food.
The what?
You did not like the food.
My mother's?
No, you did not like the brains, the kidneys, the cow stomach.
Well, they ate that stuff. They all inner stuff, yeah.
Yeah, okay. After lunch, I helped her clean up. It was a joy to work beside her. As I would be wiping the china dishes, I would stand behind her and kiss her. She would snuggle up to me with a radiant warm glow reverberated throughout me. After taking a large whitish-gray sheet off her easel, she looked at me, adjusted my profile position, folded my arms across my chest. She smiled at me and said not to move, sit still, and not to move your head. She adjusted the natural light coming through the large windows by opening the drapes more and turning a chair more into windows. I looked at her as she moved about. Yes, she was lovely, but what was that made her stand out? Was her personification and literally sprung out, yet was so silent. Yes, I loved her. I finally admitted the obvious. That was she loved me also. that was keeping us apart, a silent barrier that I could not penetrate. I sat for about 30 minutes. As I started to move slightly, she stopped her painting and came to me. She stood behind me and said, "I'm painting a beautiful portrait of you." Her hands were strong and dexterous, and they moved about. I was completely relaxed, and only I felt Renee's strong hands and her closeness how I ever wanted to end. She stopped humming and reached down and kissed me on the cheek. I stirred a little bit and pressed my head. She took both arms and went back to the easel. About a half an hour later, she said, and looked at me, picking up the palette. I gazed at her, and she struck once again by her serenity and contentment. As she painted, my eyes were again drawn to the German painters. As she painted, my eyes were drawn again to the German paintings. I did not want to think of them, but I could not help myself. They were the embodiment of everything that was wrong in the world, I thought. After a while, Renee brought the paint to me. It was a true likeness of me. She had captured the sadness in my eyes and something else, my apprehension and penetrating perspective. I took her hand and explained, "I like it. You did capture my true spirit, and you have a knack for the in-depth painting." So she was able to paint your whole portrait in about an hour.
Yeah. Well, that's how she made a living.
For about an hour.
Yeah.
And what size was it about?
I would say 3 by 3.
What?
3 by 3.
Okay. That's inches or feet? Inches or feet? Was that 3 inches or 6 inches? Or 6'3"?
No, 3 inches.
Inches. So a small painting. She glanced at it quickly and said quietly, "Let's go downstairs. I'll make some hot tea. I'm cold. I have a chill." I followed her downstairs to the kitchen. It was much warmer, with a large back iron stove, throwing off much heat and comfort. I asked her if I might bring in some more firewood for the stove, and I did not see any about. She agreed and gave me directions where the wood pile was located. It was cold and damp as I entered the side of the yard beside the house. I located the pile of wood stacked, bundled my arm, and taken as much as I could carry. As I reached the kitchen, Renee had already made the tea and set out a plate of small round tarts and biscuits. I unloaded the wood near the stove and inserted several pieces into the front opening, and then rinsed my hands at the sink. I sat at the table waiting for Renee to pour the tea. I noticed that she got unusually quiet, something I have not seen in her before. As I poured the tea, she almost became in her behavior and distressed me to see her this way.
Yes?
I took her hand and she explained what it was. "I never seen you like this." And as if to change the subject, she forced a smile and almost a whispered, "Did you like the painting?" I replied quickly, "Yes, very much."
With German.
I think it's very great. Your painting you're asking about.
Yeah.
She's asked. I think it's great. It's very professional. But she perked up a little bit after I took a sip of tea. I was still disturbed. I never seen her act in this manner, and I was thankful that it was still early so I could be with her. "What is it?" I asked, a bit frustration, and in my voice I peered at her sitting there. She moved more silently in the chair, and it was apparent there was something troubling her. I could see it in her face. She got up, went to the parlor, and returned shortly with a large album. Bringing her chair next to me, she slid the tea and tarts aside and laid the album before us on the table. She opened it to a page and revealed a photo of people I've never seen before. She explained that they were her mother and father and quickly turned the page. The next photo was a large one of 2 young men I had not seen on the table in the parlor. Renee said those were her 2 brothers. I could see that she was becoming more distraught, as it must be painful to show them. I imagined that they were all deceased, but nothing, as I did not want to add to her already disheartening task. She looked at me, holding back the tears of remorse welling up inside her. I tried to console her, but she brushed aside my gesture and mused quietly. Let me finish, I must tell you. With that, she flipped in the album. On it was a photograph of a young woman in a white habit, a novice in a religious order who was preparing to take vows. As I looked closely at the photo, I realized it was a photo of Renee. I was startled, but not altogether dismayed. The parlor had forewarned me that a little bit of displayed alerted me to the fact that she was not your average French woman. She looked at me in anticipation, seeking a reaction in my eyes to what I had seen. I got up, drew up, and put my both arms around her and hugged her tightly. Neither one of us spoke, but just stood there embraced, seeking solace in one another. After a time, I released her. All the anxieties were gone from her face. In their place were tearful, smiling, and beautiful young women. Tears were rolling down her cheeks. She was eager for my acceptance and once again in control of her destiny. There was much I wanted to ask her, but dismissed the thought that could only wait for a better time. Let's go for a walk. The cold air will refresh us, I suggested, thinking of a chance in the scenery would do us much good. I slipped on my field jacket, and Renee put on a short jacket and kerchief. The night air was cold, and it felt good. As we walked, I held her hand, and we both smiled at one another. I was happy for her, even though it was not what I had in mind for the two of us.
Wrap it up. I've got 30 seconds.
Okay.
So just ask me a question.
Okay, we're on page 382, and there's 2 more pages to the end of the chapter.
We don't have time for that.
And we'll wait.
Now, you want to go?
No,